Our fourth speaker is Lisa Yoon Lee, who is director of the Jane Addams Hull House Museum and a member of the art history faculty at the University of Illinois in Chicago. She is also the co-founder and former director of the Public Square at the Illinois Humanities Council. She received a BA in religion at Bryn Mawr and her PhD in German studies from Duke University. She also teaches classes in art and politics and the relationship between theory and practice as a visiting professor at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. She serves on a number of boards, which I shan't list them all, otherwise we would certainly run over our time. But please welcome her to speak about museums as dangerous sites.
Thanks for having me here. I'm really excited to be here. I'm going to start with a quote from a 1928 FBI file. Jane Addams is probably a member of more organizations, international, socialistic, or communistic in character than any other one individual in the United States. It is Jane Addams who is directly responsible for the growth of the radical movement among women in America. It is Jane Addams who is in the forefront of the battle in the attempt to disarm our nation. It is Hull House, the institution of Jane Addams, that has time and again been the scene of radical meetings where communists, international workers of the world, anarchists, socialists, and all subversive breeds have found shelter. That's where I work. No, it's good, right? Jane Addams, who became America's first woman to win the Nobel Peace Prize in 1931, was considered at one point in history to be public enemy #1 and also the most dangerous person in the United States. Addams' own FBI file on display in the museum is remarkably boring. It's like she went to have tea, she bought 3 hats, things like that. It is in her friend Carrie Chapman Catt's file, however, that we find the reasons why Addams was considered to be so threatening. So this would be a note to yourself and others to sort of check your friend's FBI file. As the above quote that I've just read demonstrates, Addams was considered dangerous because she was a suffragist who agitated for equal rights for women and an unwavering peace activist in a time of war. But the crucial reason why she was under FBI surveillance was for the simple reason that she opened the Hull House settlement doors, where she lived and worked, to people who did not always have popular or mainstream views. Addams created opportunities for people to assemble and discuss controversial ideas. She recognized that all the protests in the world would not be enough to bring about a more socially just world, and that we also needed to have spaces to convene, argue, and grapple with hard issues. The Hull House settlement was this place for many immigrants, social reformers, writers, and others who found a home there. Within the settlement walls, people were able to unleash their imaginations and envision a different world. This commitment to radically democratic and inclusive public space challenged power and authority. The Jane Addams Hull House Museum cultivates this art of being dangerous. It is in this dangerous spirit that it inspires our exhibits and public programming. We embrace the notion that a truly public sphere is one that exists to foster dissent and dialogue. This is what Iris Marion Young argued was the way that democratic pluralism is best served, when discourse is not reduced to the procedures of superficial consensus building, but rather structured around fostering dissent. Many people assume that being a public institution means presenting a so-called fair and balanced point of view. But the museum draws its inspiration from the history of the Hull House settlement. We use history as a lens through which to understand and approach contentious topics and to engage the public on critical social issues that are too often evaded or muffled in polite society. We believe that our mission at the museum includes not only preserving and collecting artifacts or telling the stories of Hull House reformers and the immigrants and community members that stream through the settlement's doors each week, but also to show the continuing relevance of this history. We do not preserve history by calcifying it. The museum tells the story of Jane Addams so that it can have meaning to multiple generations to come in order to educate, excite, and inspire social change. I'm going to give 3 examples of recent projects at the museum, which will illustrate how we have interpreted and grappled with Hull House history in the attempt to honor and remain true to our dangerous legacy. We live in a culture where we've grown accustomed to being addressed like consumers in every instant of our lives. Whether it is shopping for deodorant, cars, social causes, or education, the value of human life and our significance as sentient, sensuous human beings has been eclipsed by our ability to shop and our perceived purchasing power. This is also the case in many museums, where the gift store has become a seamless extension of the exhibit. However, other forms of consumption also permeate the museum, most notably in the way history is sold through the labels on artifacts and text panels. Visitors are expected to buy wholesale what we tell them happened at our sites. As informal sites of learning, public museums have the potential to encourage critical thinking and questioning, to cultivate the emergence of a new political agent. This would require public museums to foster curiosity and inquisitiveness, and to create exhibits and spaces for the visitor to not simply consume history as objectively presented, but to actively engage in history and participate in the making of its meaning. The former way of approaching history represents the past in a way that misleads us to believe that we are somehow outside of history looking in. The latter allows us to enter into a fresh relationship with the past so that we can assume responsibility, feel connected, and claim history as our own. One example of how we tried to do this is through an alternative labeling project that we launched around one of the most captivating history objects in our collection, a painting from 1898 of Mary Rosé Smith. This painting is by the accomplished artist and teacher Alice Kellogg Tyler. There is no consensus among scholars or family members about how to describe Rosé Smith and Addams's relationship. Rosé Smith is sometimes described in historical records as a prominent Hull House patron, and at other times as Addams's companion, or her lesbian lover, or her lifelong partner. The history of sexuality is often a site of contestation. Given the cultural and historical specificity of language, there are problems with appropriating current understandings of words such as lesbian or life partner to a Victorian-era relationship between women. Jane Addams's own complex relationship to intimacy, sexuality, and desire could also be considered. There were also additional questions that we wanted to ask. Why should we even care? What is at stake in how we describe their relationship? Who gets to decide? We wanted the painting to inspire visitors to think more critically and broadly about the history that is interpreted in the museum. In addition, we hope to make connections between and to reflect on their relationship to that history and their issues in their own daily lives. So we turned to the research of respected historians, including Victoria Brown, Lucy Knight, Alan Davis, and Rima Schultz. We also consulted historians of sexuality and gender, such as John D'Amelio and Lauren Berlant. From their studies, we crafted 3 different museum labels, and we asked museum visitors to post their feedback on a comment board on display in the museum. The labels we created read as follows. So we said we had one panel that said that these labels show different interpretations, how we might describe an artifact in a museum. Which label do you feel is appropriate? Which label do you find more informative and meaningful? And why do you feel this way? So the first one says, Mary Rosé Smith was Jane Addams's companion for decades and one of the top financial supporters of Hull House. Alice Kellogg Tyler's relationship with the Hull House began in 1890. She taught, lectured, and exhibited here until her early death in 1900. A teacher at the Art Institute of Chicago, Kellogg Tyler received many honors for her work. This painting was commissioned at the same time as the portrait of Jane Addams that hangs in the next room. So this was actually a label that was very similar to one that used to hang next to the painting when I first came to the museum. The painting sort of got a lot of attention, and so the previous directors didn't really know exactly what to do, so they pushed the painting upstairs sort of out of view until we could figure it out. The next label we created was Mary Rosé Smith was Jane Addams's life partner and one of the top financial supporters of Hull House. Given the emotional intimacy that is expressed in their letters to one another, it is hypothesized that they were lesbians. It is, however, difficult to determine this for sure, particularly considering the differences in sexual attitudes of the Victorian era in which she lived and Jane Addams's own complex relationship on the ideals of Platonic love. And then the third one was, Mary Rose Smith was Jane Addams's partner and one of the top financial supporters of Hull House. They shared a deep emotional attachment and affection for one another. Only about one half of the first generation of college women ever married men. Many formed emotional, romantic, and practical attachments to other women. In letters, Addams referred to herself and Rose Smith as married to each other. Hull House women redefined domesticity in a variety of ways. Addams writes in another letter to Rose Smith, "Dearest, you have been so heavenly good to me all these weeks. I feel as if we had come into a healing domesticity which we never had before, as if it were the first affection had offered us." Jane Addams burned many of her letters from Mary Rose Smith. There have been many thousands of responses, and after placing the project on the museum's website, people from around the globe have shared their comments. We have been surprised by the great diversity of our visitors, as exhibited through their comments, and we have learned about their hunger for more historical information that moves beyond simple dates and facts. And perhaps the most important thing that this exhibit has taught us is that democracy is messy and strangely unfamiliar. Inviting visitors to step out of their prescribed role as consumers means that we must also relinquish our identities as the purveyors of knowledge. Surrendering control over the dominant narrative is both terrifying and liberating because it allows us to enter a new relationship with the museum visitor. This project allows us to begin to appreciate a truly public sphere for discourse and dissent, such as the one we talk about in our tours. And I should say also, just for a sort of museum ethics crowd, we had so many different ethical dilemmas that popped up with this project. For example, many Girl Scout troops and some Catholic school groups that came through the museum would say, "Oh, we love Jane Addams, but could you not talk about that whole section on the tour?" And so we debated this back and forth, and we sort of thought, well, what if there was sort of wealthy real estate groups that came through and said, "Oh, could you not talk about the gentrification and urban development part, on the tour?" And so we decided that we really would have to talk about all aspects of this history, and that, because it was a painting of a woman relationship, if it was a painting of her husband, for example, it wouldn't be as if we're talking about sex, it would be we're talking about her partner. And so that we sort of enforced that no one could say to museum educators, talk about this, but not that. Hull House history is a reminder that the public sphere is something that is and has always been historically constructed, creatively imagined, and defined as the result of struggle. In 1889, before women had won the right to vote, when white gloves and corsets were still the norm, and young women of privilege were expected to get married immediately after college, Jane Addams paved a new path. Addams stormed the public sphere and co-founded the Hull House settlement with her best friend, Ellen Gates Starr, in the Chicago's 19th Ward, one of the most impoverished areas of the city and home to the majority of the city's immigrant population. As part of the first generation of American women to attend college, Addams broke through boundaries and crossed numerous borders. She was a white person working in communities of color, a wealthy, privileged person addressing issues of poverty, and a woman who entered the male-dominated and male-defined public sphere. The Hull House settlement facilitated this kind of border crossing for the communities of people who came through its doors. 9,000 immigrants a week came to Hull House to participate in programs that included music, poetry, art, citizenship, sex education, and literature classes. There were also nightly lectures about race, suffrage, economics, and integrated sports clubs and teams. The settlement fed their intellectual curiosity and their hunger for community, and also fed their bellies. The Hull House Coffee House and the public kitchen operated from 1891 and was a space where people dined, communed, nourished, and sustained themselves and each other. One of the most brilliant ways of framing their efforts is described by Dolores Hayden as the Grand Domestic Revolution. In her illuminating book of the same title, she argues that the reform work that Hull House engaged in, such as advocating for public housing and public health, working to end child labor, shutting down sweatshops, and creating the juvenile justice court, should be understood as forms of civic housekeeping. Hull House reformers, like many other women of that period, extended the notion of home into the public sphere, demanding that the state take responsibility for the basic needs of its people. Hull House reformers such as Charlotte Perkins Gilman, Florence Kelly, and Julia Lathrop used the language and vision of domesticity as a framework for their social vision. Even the cooperative living spaces that were created by Hull House architecture disrupted the domestic space that made women's work invisible and called into question women's sphere and women's work. The settlement house, both physically and metaphorically, challenged the division of household space from public space and the separation of the domestic economy from the political economy. Throughout history, the excluded have flipped the script and creatively used what has been narrowly prescribed to them as a weapon for taking hold of cultural apparatuses. The Hull House reformers placed old forms of domesticity into new frameworks and changed their significance. We decided to reopen the kitchen at the Hull House Museum and draw on the domestic revolution begun by the Hull House, but reinterpreted for our own day. We started a program called Rethinking Soup, which would use our historic residence dining hall as a public forum, a museum exhibit, a learning center, and a laboratory. This room is a beautifully reconstructed arts and crafts dining hall that hosted Ida B. Wells, W.E.B. Du Bois, Eleanor Roosevelt, Gertrude Stein, and other important social reformers. They met to share meals and ideals, debate one another, and conspire to change the world. Our program would include a series of community conversations on contemporary issues about food, a topic that is in the headlines every day and has emerged as one of the world's most important issues. Jane Addams herself advocated for access to food both locally and around the world, all the while linking food issues to women's rights, labor, poverty, and other social causes. We take her broad framework of food justice as our own today, and we looked both to the past and to the future. We make connections between problems of obesity in the United States and other parts of the world where millions of people are finding food prices slipping out of their reach and starving. We ask what exporting our fast food values has to do with images of Haitians reduced to eating mud cakes. We reflect on our agricultural policies and ask what we might do to we reflect on our agricultural policies and what that might have to do with the tortilla protests and unrest in Mexico. And we discuss the effects of scientific innovations in seed engineering on farming communities throughout the globe. Every Tuesday at noon, an average of 100 people gather over a free hot meal of soup and bread made from local ingredients to hear from activists, farmers, doctors, economists, artists, and guest chefs about a range of issues. Topics in the recent weeks have included urban agriculture and gentrification, food in schools, the politics of food service vendors, immigration regulation, and labor policies that affect those who pick and harvest our food. We wanted our efforts to be sustainable in every sense of the word. To this end, we became co-producers and started an urban agricultural site on a nearby vacant property. This idea of co-production further challenges the consumer identity. This endeavor creates an opportunity for farm-to-school partnerships with local public schools, offers a community garden, and includes food-focused museum tours and activities. We can now grow our own food and preserve and pickle what we can't use right away. This process led us to another project called Preserving Equality, Preserving Fruits and Vegetables. This is where we playfully invoke the importance of preservation in both historic house museums and in the local food movement. Preserving fruits and vegetables is a critical part of sustainability. It allows us, for example, to partake of the delicious scent and flavor of a peach in the dead of winter by opening a jar of local preserves, instead of relying on peaches shipped from halfway around the globe. Since local fruits and vegetables are so abundant and delicious during certain times of the year, we decided to can the excess and sell them to the public to both generate income for the soup kitchen and to educate the public about seasonality. This project would also represent the opportunity to honor the trailblazing women of the Grand Domestic Revolution, many of whom earned home economics degrees because Bachelor of Arts and Bachelor of Science degrees were denied to women. On each label of canned tomatoes or peaches is a brief biography of important revolutionary. So this one is our tomatoes, which we actually just sold out of at the local market. And they're really expensive, actually, but people buy them like crazy, so it's a little bit wacky. So this one is called Preserving Immigrant Rights, Preserving Tomatoes, and we tell the story of Ellen Swallow Richards, who was a chemist and home economist, and she applied scientific principles to domestic topics such as nutrition, fitness, food, clothing, and sanitation. She developed efficient practices that would allow women more time for activities other than cooking and cleaning. Now, I have to say that half the time when I can't find my staff, they're in the kitchen preserving, and so it's a little bit ironic that Alan sort of worked so hard to get us out of the kitchen, and we're just like trying to run back. The other thing is, it also provided a huge opportunity for us to raise new funds because, as you might know, the sort of slow food movement and all of this sort of food ecology is really a rapidly growing field. And so we were able to sort of fund this project by getting 20 new donors to give $5,000 each, and sort of that funded the farm and all of our other work. And these were all new donors who had never known or even heard anything about Jane Addams, but were really excited by our work here. This project has not only allowed us to bring two important movements together, but to expand the stories that are told at the museum. I strongly believe that an ethical imperative of our history museum is to ask ourselves every so often which stories are being told and which are not. And more importantly, we can begin to ask the more dangerous question, who gains by leaving these stories out, and what is at stake in their retelling? This commitment to giving voice to the lives of the forgotten addresses the historical and selective amnesia that afflicts us all too often. So the third project I'm going to talk about is our immigration projects. One of the most important issues that our historical site and museum addresses is that of immigrant rights. It is a topic that is politically charged, divisive, and often generates much heat and little light. However, we believe that immigration is one of the defining issues of our times. Instead of sitting on the sidelines or keeping quiet, we wanted to explore how Hull House history might illuminate contemporary immigration issues and create a space for dialogue and dissent about this contentious topic. Addams and others at the Hull House, including innovative and fierce reformers like Grace Abbott, Sophonisba Breckenridge, and Adina Miller-Rich, helped to found and advance the work of the Immigrants Protective League. Founded in 1908, the IPL fought for immigrants' rights with determination and conscience. It helped immigrants adjust to living in America and established waiting rooms at railroad stations where multilingual men and women helped recent arrivals find their relatives or friends. Working with the newly formed Immigration Sites of Conscience, a network of museums and historic sites that are committed to using their history as a springboard for dialogues about contemporary immigration, we created a post-tour dialogue that fosters civic discussion about immigration issues. These facilitated conversations, led by trained museum educators, are not intended to be debates that would reinscribe dichotomous positions or encourage a simple us versus them logic. Instead, we encourage participants to not only articulate what they believe, but also to excavate why and how they came to that way of thinking. We ask participants to talk about the dense social, political, cultural, and interpersonal influences that shape the way they think and listen to others tell their own stories. In other words, we promote critical generosity. This term was first introduced to me by Koya Paz, the artistic director of the Teatro Luna, one of our partners, Chicago's all-Latina theater company. Critical generosity informs their dramatic productions that are plays that take a stand and create community, not by ignoring or flattening differences, but by bringing them to light in honest ways, gently placing them alongside each other as evidence of a whole. Central to their work is the belief that we are a nation deeply scarred by an ongoing history of racism, sexism, and xenophobia, and that we will only heal ourselves when we are honest about how these structures work. Teatro Luna's productions prove that performances can help by exposing the seams in ways that make people laugh, make people think, and make people care about one another. But this requires an approach to political performance that is not just critical of a problem or one another, but generous in its understanding that in order to make change, we must reckon with the whole of human lives. For example, in a drama about immigration in the United States, where one of the characters is an undocumented laborer and the other a member of the independently organized border control militia, the Minutemen, the stance of critical generosity demands evaluation and criticism of each character's position, while simultaneously insisting on being receptive to the vision of the world that they both put forth. This willingness to be critical while at the same time trying to understand where and how someone comes to believe what they believe is the hallmark of critical generosity. These two stances are not often found together, particularly in a culture where interactions are so often characterized by either aggressive and confrontational debate or insincere and polite agreement. Contrary to the oft-cited sentiment, we do not think talk is cheap, or believe that what we need is less talk and more action. Instead, we insist that talking to one another is the cornerstone of a democracy, and while we understand that talking is not the solution, it is the challenge. This past year, on December 10th, the anniversary of Addams winning the Nobel Peace Prize, the state of Illinois celebrated Jane Addams Day, the first honorary day named after a woman in our state. Addams also had a 79-mile segment of the Northwest Tollway, I-90, named after her. Although Addams would have probably preferred a freeway, but that's okay. These are both causes for celebration. But like every other historical icon, Jane Addams runs the risk of being mainstreamed and stripped of her edginess and vibrancy that so defined her. Many of our visitors come to the museum to pay homage to America's first woman to win the Nobel Peace Prize. They are not familiar with the dangerous Jane Addams, who spent her life fighting injustice and redefining what peace was. A famous and favorite quotation of mine of hers provocatively asserts, "Peace is not merely an absence of war, but the nurture of human life and the establishment of social, political, and economic justice for all, without distinction of sex, race, class, or creeds." For Addams and the other Hull House reformers, working for peace meant agitating for public housing and public health, fighting for immigrants' rights, women's rights, juvenile justice, and labor reforms. A peaceful state included the right to exercise free speech and public spaces for dissent and civic dialogue. This year, for Jane Addams Day, we decided to take our work to the streets in one of the most public of all spaces, the Chicago Transit Authority. On the back of buses and inside Chicago L trains and in the metro, there are announcements of the anniversary with these two signs. We hope people will consider the legacy of Jane Addams and that her quote will provoke reflection and perhaps discussions between strangers on a train. We know that that's also pretty dangerous. You're not supposed to talk to strangers. I just told that to my 10-year-old the other day, and I thought, oh my gosh, I'm such a hypocrite. Our own project is inspired. Our project is inspired by Danielle Allen's beautiful essay, Talking to Strangers. In this work, she argues that in order for us to realize the promise of democracy, we must root out the seeds of distrust that have calcified between people and replace them with a citizenship of political friendship. Talking to people whom we do not know and those unlike ourselves becomes one of the most fundamental and practical tools of citizenship and part of the important process of revitalizing a democracy. Now, as we all know, this is a thing that's considered dangerous, but our museum embraces being dangerous in these ways, and the projects described above attempt to remember the dangerous Jane Addams. It is a given that our work in the museum includes the preservation of the buildings and artifacts of the settlement, but it should also include a continuing and passionate engagement with the issues that matter to Hull House reformers, which is the reason why our historic site is so meaningful and worth preserving at all. We believe that by animating the museum with her commitment to the creation of radically democratic space and engaging with important contemporary social issues, we preserve our historic site in the most ethical and honest way. Thanks.